Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our brand new study. We're going to study Church Dogmatics by Emil Brunner. And who is Brunner? Brunner was a disciple of Karl Barth, but he ended up in the United States. He studied at Union Theological Seminary, and he was a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, where they had the Center for Barth Studies. So Brunner was very popular in the United States. He obviously he is a disciple of Barth, so he does teach from a perspective of neo-orthodoxy, very conservative, evangelical. That is his position. But within Karl Barth's neo-orthodoxy, Brunner emphasizes personalism. Brunner emphasizes God as a self, God as person, God as a self. God can never become object for Emil Brunner. Barth taught the same thing, but Brunner emphasized this aspect of Barth's theology. He emphasized God as subject, and therefore truth is subject, and truth is acquired through relationship. So it's keep that in mind. What we're going to do in this first lesson, we're just going to take a look at an introduction, pages 3 to 14, and just to kind of get our bearings before we get into the doctrine of God. So let's go to block 1, the position of dogmatics. Dogmatics takes place within the church, and we are conscious of being commissioned for such a task. Christian faith creates the possibility for dogmatics. The possibility of dogmatics, the place of dogmatics is defined in a provisional way because the church is already a teaching church. It takes up the teaching of doctrine. Dogmatics makes up the content of that teaching. However, it took 200 years for dogmatics to even emerge as a discipline. It was 200 years after the church was established that a formal church dogmatics emerged as a theological activity. Now, the content of dogmatics is the science of Christian teaching within the place of the church only by genuine believers, and it expresses a faith type of thinking. Think about that. In other words, it's beyond propositional type teaching. It's a faith type of thinking, and that's going to be difficult to express. Thus, Karl Barth's theology. Sometimes it can only be expressed in paradox. That's the position that Barth took. That's the position that Brunner took. But church dogmatics expresses a faith type of thinking. It is academic study, but it is controlled by the church. It is church dogmatics. Now, of course, there are going to be objections. So we're going to go to block 2. We're going to look at 4 objections to dogmatics. Okay? Of course, there are going to be objections. Here we go. Block 2, note 1, considerations. Is there a truth to be believed? That's a question we ask today because all there is today is subjectivity. There's no objective truth. No one's willing to affirm an objective, absolute truth. Everything is subjective, and it's become, truth has been turned on its head. It's today's situation in our culture it's terrible. So that's a valid question. That's a valid question. Is there a truth to be believed, and does dogmatics claim to be this kind of truth? In a way, dogmatics is closely related to apologetics, the defense of the faith. Now, the first and second objection. First, intellectual dogmatic rigidity must be guarded against. It can't be rigid propositional truth. That would be something that we learned in the book of Romans that Paul first held as a Pharisee. Intellectual dogmatic rigidity must be guarded against. Number 2, dogmatic notions are generally abstractions, and they could conflict with the concrete speech of the apostles. The gospel is always a call to action. So it can't remain in theory. It can't remain simply abstract theory, or it's not really what we would call church dogmatics. That's a legitimate thing to consider. Now the third and fourth objection. Third, dogmatics is theory, but faith is obedience. Notice, dogmatics must include a response. It must be, in the words of Barth, it must be dialectical. Brunner accepts that same position. It must be dialectical. That's an important consideration. After all, it is neo-orthodox dialectical theology, so that objection is a solid one. That is a solid one. Because the response, the dialectical response, has to be included in the theory of dogmatics. You have to go from theory to praxis, to back to theory, back to praxis. Remember, praxis, P-R-A-X-I-S, is action and reflection within that ministry of going out of ourselves into the world. So, legitimately, church dogmatics needs to be theory and praxis. It cannot just remain theoretical. It has to become dialectical and include response. And primarily, dogmatics is a sphere of recollection. Now, the fourth objection, faith emphasizes the reality of encounter with Christ. Truth can only be understood through the ministry of praxis. There you go. There's that word praxis. Truth can only be understood through the ministry of praxis, action and reflection as we go out of ourselves into the world and then learn the truth in the midst of that activity, and then return to the introspective internal moment. We must take up action and suffering. Understanding is acquired dialectically. That is a legitimate concern. That is a legitimate consideration. Understanding is acquired dialectically. We can't sit in a room and do church dogmatics and say, okay, now we have the truth. No. Truth must be learned through dialectical praxis, action and reflection, action coupled with reflection. Going out of the self, what's that word? We learned it in Romans, agape. Going out of the self in agape, self-sacrificial, self-giving love, and then returning out of that activity to introspective reflection, where we can refine the truth that we began with, and then we have a refined truth that is ready to go out of itself again. It's an ongoing dialectical acquisition of the truth, of understanding. So let's go to block 3. After 200 years, church dogmatics does emerge. After 200 years. So, how does dogmatics emerge? It becomes a relative necessity of the church, and it had a threefold source. It began as a struggle against false doctrine. Remember, especially, there was challenges and real debate concerning Christology. How do we define Christ? And that became the topic of many of the early church councils. So dogmatics began first as a struggle against false doctrine, especially Christology. It was also used for preparation for the rite of baptism. And it does flow out of the work of biblical interpretive exegesis. Obviously, it does flow out of biblical interpretive exegesis. But we must remember that the Bible is not a book of doctrine. Instead, it contains confessions of faith. And we want to express dogmatics as a faith type of thinking. And when you express faith type of thinking, Karl Barth said, well, the only way you can do that is through paradox and the dialectical relationship between those extremes of paradox. That is the best way to express a faith type of thinking. God is wholly other. God is transcendent. But God is also personal and incarnate. There's the paradox. God is transcendent, but God communicates himself through revelation and incarnate love. And that's exactly what Barth proposed in his theology. That is precisely what Brunner took up in America. And that foundationally has to be remembered. The Bible contains confessions of faith, and dogmatics will express faith type of thinking. Now, Block 3, Note 2. The doctrine of the Bible comes from a systemization of theology based on a ecclesiastical normative decision. And Brunner says it's a never-ending task. And it's a never-ending task because divine revelation is always in dialogue, always in dialectical relationship with the human doctrine of dogmatics. Dogmatics is never finished because it's always in a dialectical relationship with revelation. And what's revelation? It isn't just Scripture, it's Scripture coupled with what? For Barth and Brunner, it's Scripture coupled with personal encounter with a personal God as self. And that's going to be where we're going to be headed in this study, because Volume 1 of the Dogmatics is all about the doctrine of God, but Brunner wants to lay down some foundational considerations, and I think he's done a good job here. For me, primarily, Christian doctrine as dogmatics must express a faith type of thinking, not rigid propositional statements, but a faith type of thinking. And I think that's crucial. And it also has to be acquired dialectically. It cannot be the scholar sitting in the office doing studies, writing up church dogmatics, without ever engaging in the going out of the self in praxis, action, and reflection, and then in that experience acquiring a new revision of truth, and then returning inward and through introspective critique and work refine the truth, refine the dogmatics one began with, and then that process goes on and on and on. It's a never-ending task, says Brunner. I agree with that completely. It is a never-ending task. So from the introduction, we have to take away from Block 1, Note 3, dogmatics will express a faith type of thinking. From Block 2, Note 3, we have to remember that faith emphasizes the reality of encounter with Christ, and that understanding is acquired dialectically. And then finally, Block 3, Note 2, subpoint D, dogmatics is acquired through the ongoing dialectical relationship between revelation and human doctrine. That's going to wrap up our introduction. In our next lesson, we're going to look at chapter 3. It's going to be pages 14 to 22. It'll be on the concept of revelation.